Everyone has thought about this. Maybe in the middle of the night, maybe after losing someone, maybe in a quiet moment when life felt too fragile. What happens in the first seconds after you die? Most people imagine darkness, nothingness, the end. But what if that entire image is built on an assumption that has never been proven? And what if what happens in those first seconds is not the end of you, but the end of something you were using to perceive yourself? This question is not religious. It's not mystical. It is one of the most serious investigations that science, philosophy, and human experience have ever attempted to answer. And what they found will surprise you. I am not here to give you easy comfort. I won't tell you that everything will be fine, that there's a heaven waiting, that the pain of loss has a simple explanation. What I want to do is something different. I want to invite you to question the premise, because most of the fear we feel around death doesn't come from death itself. It comes from an assumption we absorbed without noticing that you are your body, and if that assumption is wrong, then everything you believe about what happens after needs to be reconsidered from the ground up. The heart stops. That is the first event, the most familiar, the most feared. Within seconds, the flow of oxygenated blood to the brain is cut off. Cells begin to lose energy. The neuronal electrical activity, that complex web of signals, sustaining everything you think, feel, and perceive, starts to fade. The senses shut down in sequence. Vision goes first, then touch, then hearing. The body gradually ceases to be a window to the world. And the question medicine asks is, what happens to the organs, the tissues, the cells? But that is not the question that matters here. The question that matters is, what happens to the experience? Because there is a fundamental difference between mapping what happens to matter and understanding what happens to whoever was using that matter. Science is extraordinarily precise at describing the biological cascade of death. It knows exactly when each system fails, in what order, with what physical consequences. But there is a boundary it has not yet crossed with honesty. The boundary between the physical process and subjective experience, between the brain going dark and the observer disappearing. And now here's the part almost nobody considers. Those two things may not be the same thing. If consciousness were nothing more than electrical activity, it would vanish the instant the signals ceased. No delay, no transition, nothing. Like switching off a light. But what near-death experience researchers have documented across dozens of studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals is that this is not what people report. What they describe as a continuity of experience at a moment when, by all physical parameters, there should be no experience whatsoever. This doesn't prove anything definitively, but it raises a question that 20th century physics already posed in very serious terms. Perhaps consciousness is not a product of matter. Perhaps it's the other way around. Imagine all your senses switching off at once. No vision, no sound, no touch, no smell, no taste. The physical world, as you know, it simply disappears. Not because it ceased to exist, but because the instruments you were using to perceive it stopped working. Now the real question, does the disappearance of the external world mean the disappearance of the observer? Because those are two completely different things. The world you perceive is a construction happening inside your experience. But what builds that experience is not the world out there. It is something within you that receives, interprets, and transforms signals into lived reality. Perhaps what we call reality is just one specific type of perception, a particular frequency of experience shaped by the limits of the physical senses. When you sleep and dream, the physical world disappears completely from your perception. Your eyes are closed. Your ears don't process the environment the same way. Your body is still, and yet you are somewhere. You see, feel, interact, sometimes even make decisions inside a reality that is built entirely without any direct external sensory input. That matters because it shows that experience does not necessarily depend on the physical world to exist. It depends on the consciousness that sustains it. This is where near-death experience accounts become impossible to ignore, not as proof, but as an opening of possibility. Bing van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist who published his study in The Lancet, documented cases in which clinically dead patients with no measurable brain activity described coherent, detailed, verifiable experiences. People who reported observing their own resuscitation from an external vantage point, who described conversations taking place in other rooms of the hospital, who brought back information they could not have obtained through physical senses, because the physical senses were not working. The silence of the senses, in those cases, was not the silence of consciousness. It was only the silence of one specific type of perception. Think about dreaming. Not lucid dreaming, not any extraordinary experience. The ordinary dream, the one you have every night. Your body's lying still, completely disconnected from the physical reality around it. Your eyes are not seeing, your muscles are not moving, and yet you are somewhere, you are having an experience, sometimes vivid, sometimes emotional, sometimes disturbing enough to wake you with your heart racing. The experience was happening without any direct physical stimulus sustaining it. That is something that happens to you every single night, and it tells us something important. Consciousness can operate without the body being active. But there is something even deeper. During REM sleep, the phase in which dreams are most intense, the brain displays activity patterns that in some ways resemble the waking state that might suggest the brain generates the dream experience. But the hard problem of consciousness, the one David Chalmers framed and neuroscience has still not resolved, remains. Why does any physical activity produce subjective experience? Why is there something it is like to be you while you dream, rather than just processing happening in the dark? The answer materialism offers is incomplete, and quantum physics, especially in the interpretations of researchers like Amit Goswami, is beginning to suggest that consciousness may be the primary field, and the brain the instrument tuned into it. And now here's the part almost nobody considers. If consciousness can operate without the body being fully active, as in dreaming, then the complete shutdown of the body does not automatically prove the shutdown of consciousness. That is a logical conclusion, not a spiritual one. We are not talking about faith. We are talking about an inference based on what we have already observed about how consciousness works. The body may be the interface, the channel, the tuning instrument. And when the instrument stops, the real question is not whether the music ended. The real question is whether there was something beyond the instrument sustaining the music from the very beginning. Perhaps the first seconds after death are not the end of you. Perhaps they are the end of the physical interface. Think about what it's like to use a virtual reality headset. You put the device on and enter a world that is entirely constructed, with its own rules, its own textures, a sense of presence so strong that your nervous system responds as if it were real. And when you take the device off, the virtual world disappears. But you don't disappear. You simply stepped out of the interface. What death may be within this perspective is the removal of a far more sophisticated, far more immersive interface, the one we call the physical body and sensory system. The experience it was generating, but the one who was having the experience. But there is something even deeper. The oldest contemplative traditions on the planet do not describe death as extinction. They describe it as transition. The Tibetan Book of the Dead speaks of states of consciousness that unfold after death, each with its own qualities of experience. The Seth teachings, channeled by Jane Roberts, describe death as an expansion of perception, a moment in which the sensory filters that confined consciousness to physical experience simply dissolve. We are not citing these sources as definitive authority. We are citing them as convergence when cultures that never communicated with each other describe the same structure of transition that deserves serious attention. Perhaps what changes in the first seconds after death is the type of experience, not existence itself. Perhaps consciousness continues, but without the sensory filters that confined it to this specific channel of perception. Without eyes that only see within the visible spectrum. Without ears that only capture certain frequencies. Without a nervous system that translates everything into linear narrative, sequential time, three-dimensional space. What would it be like to perceive without those filters? We cannot know from inside this experience, but the question itself already reveals something that what we call reality may be only a filtered version of something far greater. And death, perhaps, is the moment the filter is removed. Sit with this for a moment. If the first seconds after death are the end of an interface and not the end of you, then what does that change about how you are living right now? Because most of the weight we carry, the frantic urgency, the constant fear of losing, the anxiety of not being enough, comes from believing that this body, this life, this specific window of time is everything you have and everything you are. If that's not true, If you are something vaster that is moving through a human experience rather than being a human experience trying to survive, then every moment here carries a different kind of weight. Not lighter, different, more intentional, more present, like someone who knows they are passing through. And because of that, pays attention to every detail of the landscape. So we've reached the end of the video, but perhaps the beginning of an unease that will stay with you. We investigated what happens at the physical level in the first seconds after death. We explored the silence of the senses and what it reveals about the nature of experience. We grounded ourselves in the logic of dreaming to show that consciousness can operate beyond the active body. And we arrived at a possibility that science does not yet know how to dismiss, and that the oldest traditions never dismissed, that the first seconds after death are not the end of you. They are the end of a way of perceiving. I don't have the definitive answer. Nobody does. And anyone who claims they do deserves your skepticism. What I have is a question, and I leave it with you. If you are not the body, then what exactly ends when the body stops? If this video touched something in you, a doubt, a recognition, an unease you don't yet have words for, leave it in the comments. You don't need a ready answer. Sometimes the right question is already the beginning of an expansion. Like the video, if you feel this kind of investigation is worth carrying forward, and if you haven't subscribed yet, consider it not to receive certainties, but to keep questioning alongside people who have chosen not to accept the surface of things. Consciousness is expanding, and you are here.